Thanks, Bianca. We're joined now by South Carolina Congressman and House Majority Whip James Clyburn. Congressman, great to have you here on Morning Rush. So fortunate to have you on MLK Day. You were, of course, in attendance in 1967 for Dr. King's last speech in South Carolina. How should we honor his legacy on this day, and what can you tell us about that last speech?
Well, thank you very much for having me. You know, as we think about King's, that last speech in South Carolina was July, about 8 months before his assassination in April, the following April. And I remember that speech so well because, as you recall, King had broadened his involvement to a great extent. And he was getting a lot of criticism because he'd come out against the Vietnam War. And that called for a lot of criticism from his detractors. And the interesting thing about that is when you look at King's popularity, it had fallen to an all-time low, all about his getting involved in stuff that he was not expected to be involved in. That was a little bit like the Civil Rights Movement. And when we all started out in 1960, when I first met King, we were pushing for social integration, desegregating schools, getting off the back of the bus, being able to sit down at lunch counters. And after the passage of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, you may recall, we got the Civil Rights Act in 1964. And the reason that act passed is because Lyndon Johnson agreed with his Republicans to take voting out of it. He took housing out of it. People wanted to keep neighborhoods segregated. Didn't want the blacks to have the right to vote. So when all of this was taking place, they passed the bill. Now the bill, everybody talks about it as if it's a big comprehensive bill, but the bill only outlawed discrimination in employment in the private sector. Voting came in the 65 Voting Rights Act. And Lyndon Johnson was a bit reticent about doing that. It was not until the Selma March, in the first Sunday in March in 1965, that John Lewis and Miss Amelia Boynton and Hosea Williams and others marched across that bridge and were blooded. That's why we call it Bloody Sunday. And when Lyndon Johnson saw that, and other members of the Congress, one of my biggest heroes back then was J. Everett Dirksen, the Republican leader of the Senate, Republican from Illinois. In fact, I often tell people if I had a son, I had an agreement with my late wife that the name would be J. Everett. So this is not partisan with me. The vote is all about being a full-fledged citizen. And so King, when he got into voting, his first speech in South Carolina after the Voting Rights Act was in a little town of King Street, South Carolina. And that's when he started talking about marching to the ballot box. You've marched to integrate schools. You have marched to desegregate lunch counters. You've marched to get off the back of the bus. Let us now march to the ballot box. And I've been saying to people, if there's ever been a time that we need to heed that admonition, it's going to be in 2022, because we now see states all over the South and the North. 19 states, at least 2 of those states up in the Northeast. 19 states have now passed 34 laws and introduced about 400 others to make it harder for people to vote, to turn the clock back on voting rights, and we are teetering on losing this democracy. if you can deny the vote to your citizenry, especially when you got a law that says if you don't like the way the voters voted, you can nullify the election. Yeah. Remember King's speech, the so-called March on Washington. At the end of that speech, everybody talks about how I ever dreamed. But King says it is time to go back to the South, where government have interposition and nullification dripping from their lips. Nullification. That is what they just did in Georgia.
Well, let's talk about that issue, because Republicans argue voting rights is not necessarily a federal issue, that it should be handled on a state and a local level. Here's what Republican Senator Bill Cassidy said yesterday about those changes and some of the things you've said as well. Listen.
Now Georgia has 2 days of Sunday voting that is optional, that you can do it. And by the way, there were no drop boxes before the pandemic. There were none. And now we still have drop boxes. So an accommodation made for a pandemic are going to continue in the future when theoretically the pandemic is over. And shall I point out that Georgia has more early voting days than does Delaware or New York by far. They have no excuse absentee voting. So when Representative Clyburn says a 90-year-old woman has to stand in line for 4 hours, in Georgia she doesn't. I think in Delaware she might have to.
Congressman, your reaction. He's talking directly to you.
Yes, I see that. Cassidy, well, he don't talk about Louisiana. Talk about Kentucky. You don't recall in 2020, during this pandemic, some people stood in line for 8 hours. 8 hours. He's just not telling the truth. He knows better than that. The fact of the matter is, when you get rid, well, I wonder why he didn't talk about Georgia closing precincts in black neighborhoods, Louisiana closing precincts in black neighborhoods. Kentucky had everybody in Louisville voting in one place. Now, he knows better than that. But, they get these sound bites. And I will tell him one other thing. He's supposed to be a smart man. Read Federalist Papers 59 and see what Alexander Hamilton said about who runs the election. Ask them why it is that states, by the Supreme Court, were not allowed to have term limits on Congress people, because states don't make the rules for all elections. And it's in the Constitution, and it's in the Federalist Papers that, as I said, 59 says you cannot have 50 sets of rules for federal elections. Each state can have rules for its own elections, but each state cannot make up the 50 set of rules for federal elections. It's right there in the Constitution, right there in the Federalist Papers. I would commend them to Senator Cassidy. He is just absolutely not right about that. He knows better.
And Senator Cassidy and his colleagues were furious at the way President Biden characterized this debate when he came here to Atlanta to make the case for voting rights. Listen to what he said.
So I ask every elected official in America, how do you want to be remembered? At consequential moments in history, they present a choice. Do you want to be on the side of Dr. King or George Wallace? Do you want to be on the side of John Lewis or Bull Connor? Do you want to be on the side of Abraham Lincoln or Jefferson Davis? This is the moment to decide, to defend our elections, to defend our democracy.
I know you've said that shouldn't be the focus, but is it a fair comparison to compare opponents of voting rights legislation to George Wallace and Jefferson Davis? Yes or no?
Yes. Emphatically, yes. The vote, as John Lewis would say, is sacred. And when you put in place a mechanism that says this little committee, if they don't like the way you people voted there in Fulton County, they can overturn the election. Don't tell me that what Trump was trying to do in Fulton County, Georgia, in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Detroit, Michigan, up in Wisconsin trying to nullify the votes, throw the votes out in black precincts. That's bull kind of stuff. That's Jefferson Davis stuff. That's the part of the president's speech that I admired the most. I want to know, as we used to sing right down there in Georgia, the first time I came to a SNCC meeting was, the second time was there in Morehouse College campus with John Lewis. We used to sing a song. Which side are you on? That was relevant then and is relevant now. Are you on the side of me having an unfettered right to vote? Are you on the side of those people there in Georgia who are trying to nullify a vote, who are trying to criminalize giving people a drink of water in a long line? Are you saying to me this morning that there were not people standing for 5 hours down in Georgia in 2020, in Louisiana, in South Carolina? Yes, they were, and we all know it.
It is very difficult to see those long, long lines. No American should have to endure that. We agree on that for sure, Congressman. I want to remind you how pivotal your role in electing Joe Biden was. And as you know well, it was former President Bush himself that called you the savior, the guy that turned this election, that delivered the White House for President Biden. Here he is at 33%, according to a Quinnipiac poll, 25% among independents. Are you having any buyer's remorse? And how, in your opinion, does Biden turn this thing around as we approach 2022?
I have absolutely no buyer's remorse at all. I think Joe Biden is a good president, basically because he's a good person. I think the former president was a bad president, basically because he's a bad person, has no relationship to the truth, insults people. And for some reason, the Republicans have decided to turn their party into a cult. That's the kind of cult worshiping I used to study as a college student. That is not what this country is about. Yes, I think Joe Biden is going to turn this around because I think that as we celebrate Martin Luther King Jr. today, we are going to recall what he said in his letter from the Birmingham City Jail. And when he sat down and wrote, remember, he was writing a letter to 8 white religious leaders who asked him to leave Birmingham, told him he was a disruptive force, and they wanted him to go back to Atlanta. That's when he made this famous statement, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And he said in that letter that he was coming to the conclusion that the people of ill will in our society was making a much better use of time than the people of goodwill. We saw on January 6th how effective the people of ill will are losing their time, or using their time. I think that we're going to come to the conclusion this weekend that the good people are going to start making a better use of their time. And we're going to rise up and we are going to bring to the fore people who want to see this country march toward perfection.
Congressman, I just want to close with these days, this one in particular, I think are oftentimes lost on our kids who just view this as another day off. How do you suggest parents talk to their kids about MLK, his legacy, and where we are today?
I would hope that every parent, black and white, would share with their children King's letter. Now, I've said this, a lot of people get a little nervous when I say it. I grew up in the gospel. I grew up reading the Bible. I still read the Bible. I study the Bible. It's a history book to me. King really wrote a letter that I think is second to the Bible in timeliness. I would say to every parent, get that letter, King's letter from the Birmingham City Jail. Read it with your children. Share it with them. And get them to understand exactly what was going on in this country, what we have done to overcome all of that, and what we need to do to sustain it. Because just because we have a democracy today doesn't mean we'll have one tomorrow. We've seen democratic countries fall all over the world. And they start with discrediting the press. When anybody sits down and call the press the enemy of the people, that's what the former president called you guys, the enemy of the people. We need to be pushing back on that. I may not like everything I see in the press about what I may say or do, but you are not the enemy. You are informing the public. And we public officials need to be held accountable. And that is the first thing that will give away when you start developing an autocracy.
Really appreciate you saying that, Congressman, and your reflections on MLK on this important day. Really nice to have you here. South Carolina Congressman, House Majority Whip James Clyburn. Have a great week, and thanks again.
Thank you.